Hi guys, today I want to make a watch box to hold all my precious timepieces. But in fact, the story I'm going to share with you is one of failure at pretty much every single step of the way. It all starts earlier this year while I was with my wife and kids staying with my in-laws in the south of France. And between picking fresh clementines and spending time with the family, I thought this would be the perfect moment to get started on a new craft, woodworking. My wife's father is a crafter, and while staying in Nice, I have actually got access to quite a few different workshops loaded with all manners of tools and raw material. So my goal today is to make a box. A simple box. I mean, the only difficulty in my mind being inserting a piece of glass to be able to see through and see inside. And at this stage, I've seen a ton of YouTube videos about woodworking, and I'm very confident in my success. All the YouTubers out there seem to have an easy time at it, and I'm told that making a box is a great starting point. So just how hard can it be? Well, actually, really hard, and this is something I don't tell you. But yeah, woodworking is not easy. So with a selection of planks, I make my way to the workshop that I'll be using in the more messy stages of the build. This is also where some of the bigger machines that I'll need are stored. There is, however, one machine that I'll be adding to this collection to leave my mark on this place. It's a 13-inch thickness planer sent to me by VEVOR. Now, I had no idea of this at the time, but using this machine was pretty much the only step of the build that was easy and went as planned, so I have to say thank you VEVOR for that. The planer comes in a big heavy box with the basic tools that you'll need inside, as well as a small alignment guide for whenever you need to sharpen or replace a blade. Setting it up is as easy as installing the handle, lifting up the motor block, and removing the protective inserts. While I installed the rubber feet, I'm pleased to see that the base is very sturdy and shouldn't bend during operation. It's a simple machine, a big industrial looking on and off switch, and a speed switch. And while I could have used a higher speed, I kept the planer on the slowest speed to get the best result out of it, making sure there was no tear out in the piece and hopefully give me a nice smooth surface to work off. Setting the depth is as easy as turning the handle until the marker is at your required depth. Once I'm all plugged in, I can get going, thinning out material, turning these old tired planks into usable boards. Straight away I was incredibly impressed with not only the speed and ease at which this machine was working, but also at the results I was getting. The boards would come out feeling really smooth, and yeah, while I was expecting to have some work and some sanding to do to them afterwards to make them fully usable, I would actually be very happy with these pieces as they are straight out of the planer. Next time though, I am going to have to find a way of collecting the dust and wood chips that this process creates, and definitely even a bad shop vacuum would have helped at this point. And obviously getting back home, my wife and her mother actually gave me some really dark looks because I was just covered in dust. In fact, since I was staying with my in-laws, I got a really good talking to by both of them that same night. So as you can imagine, the next day, as I got ready to work again, the first thing I did was to put on a complete overall. At this point, I found the piece of wood I want to use and have planed it down to the thickness I wanted using the planer that was sent to me by VEVOR. To cut the wood to the correct size, I'm going to use an old table saw that was previously used to cut all sorts of materials and I'm told was last used to cut lead billets. Now, I had been told a few times at this point that the blade was really tired, but I sort of assumed that anything that could cut through lead could cut through wood. I think I hadn't really understood just how tired the blade was. This machine is pretty basic and I have to attach on a rail system to ensure that my cuts remain straight and at the required depth. The blade is brought out just high enough for it to cut through the material to ensure as much as the blade is in contact with the wood at any given time. In theory, this gives you a much better cut. And here goes. And yeah, you can already tell something's off just by the way it's lifting up a small section of wood just above the cut instead of shredding it to oblivion. And yeah, see the smoke? I mean, yeah, let's take a closer look. We didn't have a spare blade at hand and the machine was cutting, and since nothing was going up in flames, I could just control the speed at which I was cutting and blow away the dust. So yeah, I just went ahead and cut my piece and eventually managed to get something usable. Once the piece was cut to size, I had a 12cm wide board to play with, and this was the measurement I was looking for initially. While this wood isn't particularly special, it's not oak, it's not walnut, and in fact it's somewhat soft, I chose this piece because I wanted to highlight the grain pattern on it that I really do find quite pleasing. At this point I want to cut out 2 grooves all along the board that will house the piece of wood at the bottom of the box as well as the glass on the lid portion. These grooves are made by running the wood through the saw with the saw set to cut only as deep as I need it to go. And while I say cut, I could have just as easily said burn. I want to add some interesting accents to the box and think that a nice chamfer on the outside and the inside edges of the top and bottom of the box will be a nice easy addition. My brother-in-law kindly lent me his router and bits so I could get my cut, and I went for a simple 45-degree chamfer. It's not the most elegant, but it does work with the final aesthetics of the piece. It's way easier doing these cuts now while the board is in one piece than doing it once the box is assembled. In fact, once the box is assembled, some of these cuts are near impossible. The overall cut was very easy to do, but I did over-tighten the bit on the machine and broke the collet that holds the bit in place when I tried to take it out. So Tom, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Next time I'm in Nice, I guess I owe you a router. At this stage, I feel like most of the big unknowns of the build have been solved and that all that's left to do is cut the 4 sides of the box and glue it up. So I carefully mark out where I want all the cuts, taking into account the measurements that I had in my head and that I wanted for the box. And this is where I make one of my first real mistakes. When marking out my measurements, I didn't take into account the 1.5cm thickness of my piece of wood, so every time I made a 45-degree angled cut, I was removing a bit of material, if not quite a bit of material. Which meant that in the end, every single side of my box is basically shrunk by about 1.5cm, meaning that while the height of the box is still correct, the overall dimensions are a bit odd, a bit of a squeeze. Tom, my brother-in-law, had also lent me this miter saw, and like many of the other big scary tools in this video, this would be my first time using one. So naturally, seeing that I can tilt the blade at 45 degrees, I think yes, this is perfect, I can cut the angles this way, as the board was too thick to be cut on the more precise horizontal plane. And while I could in theory cut 45 degrees in my mind, it wasn't a perfect 45 degrees, and I didn't know this at the time, and it was going to create a lot of frustration down the road. Yeah, this machine does give me a really smooth and satisfying cut, but at this angle however, I really can't see where the blade is coming out of on the other side of the miter saw, so each cut involved a sort of bit of guesswork, and I needed to do quite a few extra cuts just to ease up on the final size, making sure each board was at the same length. I am not showing you the footage of me cutting the smaller pieces where the blade is literally just centimeters away from my fingertips. That's not fun and I do not recommend it. I will try not to do it again. I still have 10 fingers. For now. Anyhow, everything is now cut and I have my 4 pieces. And once all aligned, you can see that gorgeous grain I was talking about earlier, and maybe, just maybe, you understand why I chose this piece. Here's a trick I got from watching other woodworkers on YouTube. To keep your pieces neatly lined up during the glue up phase, simply use masking tape on the back to hold everything where it should be. And now we can get a cool sneak peek at what the box is going to look like. Or not. Yep. James, you really didn't think that one through, did you? So fixing this is really stupidly easy, but it completely messes up the continuous pattern I had going along the box, and at this stage I was really pissed with myself. This mistake could have really easily been avoided had I thought things through. Now, do you remember when I said that the 45-degree angle on the miter saw wasn't actually 45 degrees? Well, here is when I realized this. You can see a very small gap in all the corners, but not really knowing any better, I assumed I could just squeeze the gaps shut during the glue up, so I just soldier on. First though, I do need my bottom and lid pieces. With my measurements in hand, or in this case stuck in plain view, I can grab the table saw once more. I've actually found a small piece of wood that's exactly what I need for the bottom of my box, and I really just need to cut it to size. For this, I can make use of the sliding table on the saw and get much cleaner cuts. Using an orbital sander, I can easily give the piece a good finish, as I won't be able to access this once it's in place. This wood actually turned out to be really beautiful, and it's the exact thickness I need. Once installed, you can now see just how this is going to hold in place. I don't really even need glue to hold the bottom part in. So what about the glass? Well, turns out I'm really bad at cutting glass. I spent half a day trying to learn it and just failed miserably. So luckily, I found something possibly even better. I opted to use 2mm thick plexiglass, but you wouldn't actually know it just by looking at it, and I could just cut it on the table saw just like wood, so for me this was a much deserved easy win. Seeing the box take shape is pretty confidence boosting, and I'm sure I'm reaching the home stretch on this one. So as planned, I can tape the pieces together and apply just enough wood glue for all the joints, being careful not to use too much glue, as it would be impossible for me to access any squeeze outs during the drying process. I install everything as planned and proceed to close up the box. As I'm clamping everything down, I'm very aware that the joints aren't lining up well, or in fact, at all. Actually, I'm having to tighten the clamps more and more, much more than I wanted initially in order for the joints to close up, and all this pressure is not helping me get an even fit all around. So I soon have to resort to tapping the sides while adjusting the clamps to get something that I'm sort of moderately happy with. Finally, my setup seems to be okay, and I decide to let it dry overnight to be sure it won't budge. The next day, when time has come to see if this has worked, I'm feeling quite confident. I could see that my seams were mostly nice and snug, that the glue has had plenty of time to dry, and that the clamping forces should have been completely sufficient. But... wait, hold it, let's listen to that once more. Yep, did you hear that? Again? Yep. That was bad. A quick visual inspection reveals that two of the joints have failed on me, and I'm going to have to redo all of the glue up. But only after spending a good hour and a half sanding all those joints back to a proper 45 degrees by hand. And that, again, was not fun. So this is now my second glue up, and I'm taking no chances this time around. I want to make sure that everything lines up perfectly and stays in place while the glue is drying. I'm also going to apply way more glue than previously, as it looked like the two corners that didn't fail previously were the ones of more glue. Obviously I do get a bit of squeeze out, but this will just have to do. I can always go ahead and clean this up afterwards with a chisel once the box is finished. Okay, this is the moment of truth. I'm going to loosen the clamps slowly one by one before removing them all at the same time. To make sure everything stays put exactly where I want it, I've decided to reinforce the sides with thin brass rods with the help of epoxy. I first need to cut them all up into small 2.5 to 3 cm pieces. Next, after overloading the box with masking tape, I carefully plan where my pilot holes will go, set the drill press to the right depth, and drill my holes. No, 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 do not take that out of context. Once that's done, I can mix the epoxy resin and start setting the pins in place. Initially, I was having some trouble getting the epoxy into the pilot holes, but eventually I figured out that I could just spread it on and press it in before sliding the pin into place. So while I know I'm using too much epoxy here, that's also why I wanted to overdo it on the masking tape. Initially, I had made my pilot holes deeper than they needed to be, resulting in some of the pins plunging into the wood a bit too far. So on my second round, I made sure the pins stood proud from the box as they were easy to cut off and file flush, leaving me with an overall better fit and finish. In the end, this is actually a step of the build that worked as I had planned, and that was actually easier than I had anticipated it to be. So, giving myself a break, I employed a bit of slave labour. No, that's not right. I suggested to my 5-year-old that she might enjoy helping Daddy, which, yeah, she did. This is starting to look like the box I had in mind at the start, but we still have so much work to do. First, I want to sand everything nice and flush, get that smooth finish that I need before moving on to the next step of cutting the lid off the body. It's also the best moment for me to sand all the top edges flush using a wood block and 240 grit sandpaper. Now comes one of the most critical and potentially destructive steps of the build, and of course, we're going to be doing this with the same old table saw, hoping that all goes smoothly and that I can sand off any of the unavoidable burns. I set my fence to the appropriate depth and very slowly start cutting into the box. My hope is that cutting the two pieces, body and lid, out of the same block, instead of making the lid separately, is to maintain the grain pattern all around the piece. Progress is slow, smoky and definitely scary, but it turns out just as expected, burnt, of course, but in two usable pieces. We now have a proper box, but I do need to clean up the mess and make sure everything fits up perfectly. After a lot of sanding and a 1,000 kilometer trip from Nice back to Paris, I am back in my small Parisian workshop to hopefully get this box finished. I plan on having the hinges sit flush inside the box, so I need to create a cutout for them. I could have used a router again, but I've never done that before for this type of thing, and I'm worried that I'll completely ruin the box if I make any mistakes. Luckily, I have a great set of sharpening stones and some good wood chisels, so taking my time, I can cut the slots at the required depth all by hand. This wasn't really hard, but took long enough as I knew that any slip up here could cost me the whole project. And here's a quick preview of how it's going to look. But there's a problem. My screws are too long for the lid. I recently picked up this jeweler's hand vise, and it's the perfect tool for holding the screws firmly in place while cutting them down to size using a Dremel. I carefully mark out where my holes need to be drilled using an awl, and all the while making sure that the hinges are flush on the inside of the box. I've marked my depth that I want using tape on the drill bit and can go ahead and screw the hinges into place starting on the lid. And just in case, I did add a smidge of grease on each screw just to make sure I could fit them in easily. Now at this point it had been quite a long time since the last screw up the last issue on this project, and that's a good thing. But the next one was actually the straw that broke the camel's back, or as we say in French, la goutte qui fait déborder le vase. As I closed the box for the very first time, I immediately noticed that something is off. Not by much, but enough for me to decide that this was it. This project I had in my head would not get done, or at least not today. You see, while I could carry on with this box, the fact that the lid and body don't close perfectly is a deal breaker for me. There is still a ton of work to be done before I can call this project finished, but I know that this eyesore will put me off every single step of the way. So I've decided to think out of the box. Pun intended. Indeed, the final step of this build has now come a bit earlier than expected, and that's going to be to protect the wood with a few coats of wax. Let's take a look at the final result. For someone who's never made anything like it before, without access to very accurate tools, I was able to make a pretty little wooden box with a see-through lid and brass accents. And you know what? In my book, that is a success. Sometimes it's not always about getting it perfectly right. Sometimes it's not about achieving that end goal you're looking for. Sometimes it's about the gain of experience that you get along the way. And that experience, if you take the time to analyze it, understand where you went wrong and think about how you can improve, that experience might just be worth way more than the project you set out to make. So here's my challenge to future me, James. Go out there, take those learnings, and learn some more. I want to thank VEVOR for sending me the 13-inch planer. As you saw, this was the one machine that worked flawlessly throughout the whole build. And as I have access to loads of old planks and raw timber, it suddenly allows me to create so much more in the future. Check out the link in the video description to see more of the VEVOR planer. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you've learned something, and I hope to see you very soon for some more crafting.